Welcome to Mind Your Being. Whether you're a new listener or a regular or returning listener, I'm so grateful you've taken time out to listen today, and I'm really excited for you to hear this conversation. So today's topic is about brain health, dementia, and looking at the risk factors with regard to prevention. Because dementia is now one of the leading causes of death here in Australia and in many other countries as well. And at the same time, there's been a lot of conversation and noise on social media, particularly around menopause and women's risk of dementia. So I really wanted to bring on an expert, someone who is not only incredibly qualified in this space, but also thoughtful and careful in how she communicates the science without any of the fear-based messaging. I'm so grateful to be joined by Dr Sarah McKay, a neuroscientist, Oxford University graduate, author and science communicator, who has spent decades studying the brain and translating complex neuroscience into practical, evidence-based insights we can actually use in our everyday. In today's episode, we explore what dementia actually is, what's happening in the brain as we age, particularly through midlife, and what the science really says about dementia risk. Because while there's a lot we can't control, there are also some key risk factors that we can influence across our lives. And some of them might surprise you. This is a really thoughtful, nuanced conversation, one that cuts through the noise and helps you better understand what's within your control when it comes to brain health. Let's get into it. Thank you so much for coming on today. Could you please share a bit about your background in neuroscience and how you came to be a science communicator in all things brain health?
I kind of met and fell in love with neuroscience as a scientific discipline in my first year of university, all the way back in 1993. And I kind of pursued that, I suppose, academically, in that I have an undergraduate degree in neuroscience, a master's degree in neuroscience, and a PhD in neuroscience. I then worked for a number of years in academic medical research, what we call in the industry being a postdoctoral research, also in neuroscience. But then I sort of found, for many, many reasons, the further along I got in my academic career, one thing I loved bench research, and I loved being in universities, and I loved being surrounded by other kind of academics and intellectuals and people working in this space. But I didn't like that you had to become an expert in a very niche area. I kind of got FOMO about all of the other things that we could study, and also, funding and grant applications and just a lot of the admin that's required versus just wallowing around and doing science. The two things didn't always necessarily go together very well. And I also wanted to have a family, and I wanted to kind of talk about the work I was doing, not just do the work. And sometimes I felt my niche was so narrow, no one was really interested, whereas people were interested in a broader sort of story about neuroscience. So there's kind of many kind of colliding factors happened at once, such that in about 2008, I had my oldest son and I left academia and I moved into the field of science communications and eventually set up my own business specializing in neuroscience and then brain health. It's interesting to see trends come and go. I would say kind of in the 2010, 2011, 2012 time, there was a lot of interest in Alzheimer's and dementia. And actually there were some really good public health government-funded campaigns here in Australia on dementia risk reduction. And then that kind of faded away for a while, and it's kind of come back again as something people are interested in, particularly within the space of women's health. I didn't really have an interest in women's brain health until kind of 2015, 2016, when I wrote my first book, which was looking at the woman's brain across the course of the lifespan. So it's kind of been a bit of an unstrategic career path, whereby things have kind of popped up along the way that have interested me, and I've decided to pursue them. And right now, I suppose my business and my interest is very much in this area of brain health, particularly women's brain health, across the lifespan, particularly reproductive life transitions like puberty, pregnancy, and menopause, and trying to be thoughtful and careful and translate the science that is being done out of the research lab into people's lives in a way that is non-fear-based and non-dramatic and thoughtful.
I love that. I love that you've followed your own curiosities and you've made your own path. I follow you on social media. I love that you you're not a fearmonger and you provide real evidence-based, common sense information that people can trust. And I think in this day and age of social media, it's really hard to find that. So, yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's a lot of very glossy, charismatic people out there who are very good at driving the social media algorithms. And I think there's a lot of push and commercial interest and saturation in the space of what I like to call the longevity bros, and that longevity well-being space, which is very commercially driven. And a lot of the messages, they're almost kind of like tweaking the top 1% or the peak performers or the kind of the healthiest, wealthiest. And there's just so many people, you know, taking a public health perspective where we still haven't got the basics right and don't understand the links between heart health and brain health, or looking at metabolic health, cardiovascular health, obesity, diabetes, mental health. Just all of the kind of the basics aren't necessarily in place. And the social media algorithms are kind of aimed at that kind of glossy, wealthy 1%. And it just doesn't seem to me to be very equitable, the messaging.
No, it's not equitable. It's based on the number of likes, popularity. And that is one of the reasons I started this podcast. I think we're missing the mark on getting the basics right. And I think, like every guest I speak to on here, I think if people paid more attention to getting the basics or the lifestyle medicine pillars, paying some attention to those instead of the latest health hacks or hypes, we'd get a lot more benefit.
Yeah, and lots of people don't have the resources or the capacity to make behavioural change. It's very, very difficult as well for lots of people. And there's a lot of kind of morality placed on people's ability to make lifestyle changes or not, that I think, again, is really missing the mark for a lot of the people in the population who aren't following the social media influences.
That's right, because everyone grows up with different beliefs in different households, with different role models in different areas of society, even geographically. It all impacts. If you grow up in a poorer part of the country, you're going to have less access to health services.
100%. Yeah, we see very clear health outcomes based on socioeconomic profile. The wealthier you are, the healthier you will be typically. So that's not very friendly for social media, is it?
It's not. So that's why I thank you again for coming on to podcasts like this, where the information is free and people can get trusted health experts. I've asked you on today to talk about brain health across the lifespan, but particularly with a midlife focus. And I've also asked you on to talk about the risk factors for dementia and what are some of the modifiable risk factors that we can pay attention to across the lifespan, but particularly in midlife, to try and prevent dementia. Because in many countries, definitely in Australia, dementia has taken over from cardiovascular disease as a leading cause of death. I think it's a really important topic to talk about. But before we get to looking at the risk factors, I'd like to ask you, what are some of the structural changes or what's happening in the brain in midlife?
So we've got to think about dementia and Alzheimer's disease, which dementia is an umbrella term. We could have lots of different types of diseases, and one of these that's most common that causes symptoms of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. Yep. But there are other diseases which cause symptoms of what we would call dementia. Sometimes in the literature you have Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, or ADRD. So it's probably useful to think and talk about that. Alzheimer's disease is a disease of unhealthy brain aging. It's not an inevitable outcome, and not everyone is going to get dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So, as I said, dementia is a kind of a collection of symptoms. Alzheimer's disease is about 70% of the causes of cases of dementia globally. And there are lots of different kinds of symptoms which may have different kinds of cadence or trajectories of onset at different but typically it's what we see in people in their sort of 70s, 80s and 90s is when people start to kind of show these symptoms. And it can be things like, you know, the kind of the classic forgetfulness. And it's not forgetting where you put your car keys or forgetting why you came into a room. It may be like you have your keys, but you forget what you use them for. It might not just be forgetting where you parked your car in a car park. It's never remembering how to navigate home from the shops in your car. So it's not just these kind of momentary lapses that we all have, and even teenagers and kids have, and a lot of that's around attention. It's, you know, this progressive kind of changes that we see in people's ability to go about their daily lives. It's not just verbal slips or forgetting someone, which, you know, naming 3 kids before you get to the right child's name. It's perhaps not remembering all of your children when you kind of see them, which is what we would see in the more kind of severe cases. Lots of people kind of are worrying about their brain and their cognition and head off to the doctor, and we could do screening tests, and then you would get referred on to a memory clinic if there was really real cause for concern, and then maybe go down that formal diagnosis path. But that takes a lot of time. And typically this is not what we're seeing in people in their 40s, 50s and 60s. Most of the time, this is people who are much kind of later on in life. When it comes to what is causing something like Alzheimer's disease, we have what we call risk factors. And we talk about risk factors because it's not like, say, getting the flu virus and then having the emergence of these symptoms where we know that the flu symptoms were caused by the flu virus. It's not this simple kind of cause and effect. It's really kind of a culmination of everything that's happened to you across the course of your lifespan, which may tip your brain towards showing the pathology and the symptomology of Alzheimer's disease. And we have what we would call modifiable risk factors, so things that we can modify or change about our lives. And it depends kind of where you are in your lifespan, how easy it is to modify or change these things. And then non-modifiable risk factors. And the ratio is kind of about 60-40 or 55-45. Like currently we would say about, say, 45% of cases globally of Alzheimer's disease and dementia we could perhaps reduce or eliminate if everyone did all of these things in their life perfectly. And then we have non-modifiable factors, which may be your age, you can't do anything about your age, maybe biological sex, because we know that there's a higher prevalence of women than men with Alzheimer's disease. And there's many reasons for that, which we'll get into. And then maybe your sort of your genetic background. And then variously, there are these modifiable risk factors. As I said, if everyone did this perfectly everywhere in the world, it's not necessarily about as an individual, but it's across populations. And these modifiable risk factors are reasonably well established and discussed and published out there. And so in early life, we have about 5% of cases of Alzheimer's could be eliminated if everyone had access to a very good education, all the way through childhood and adolescence. And we've got lots of people, if we think about people in the 80s and 90s, born say the 1920s, 1930s, they might not have stayed at school until age 18 and then gone off to university. My mum and dad were born in the 50s and both left school at 15. I was still at university at 25, so I've got 10 more years of formal education in my body and brain than they have. That's a modifiable risk factor, but once you reach late life, you can't necessarily do much about that. In midlife, we've got various factors. A lot of them we can kind of group together and think about things like cardiovascular health, metabolic health, things like high blood pressure and high LDL cholesterol and obesity and diabetes, and all of those kinds of having a good, healthy lifestyle whereby we're eating well, we're exercising well, we're going to the doctor, and if we've got high blood pressure, we're getting that treated. If we've got diabetes, we're getting that treated. If we've got all of those kind of cardiovascular metabolic health factors, we can kind of look at all of those together. There's a couple of others in midlife. Trying to avoid a brain injury, and that's particularly relevant for perhaps men over the age of 60 who like to climb ladders still to clean the gutters out. They've got quite a high risk of traumatic brain injury, which can increase your risk of Alzheimer's. We've got mental health, depression can increase your risk as well. And then we've got the incredibly unsexy hearing loss at midlife. We don't have any glossy, beautiful social media influencers talking about getting hearing loss treated because it's very unsexy. And it's not necessarily a female or a male specific factor there. And then later in life, we've got vision loss. We think about vision loss and hearing loss. That could be almost 10% of cases globally of Alzheimer's disease and dementia because we're not then interacting with the world because we can't see the world, we can't hear the world, we can't interact socially, we can't be out and about, moving our bodies around the world and interacting and engaging and having rich opportunities. If you kind of think about if you had hearing loss and vision loss, you're shutting down your interactions with the world, and then that's not very good to keep your brain kind of ticking over. It's more strain and stress on your brain cognitively, and we're not stimulating those pathways. All of the kind of the obesity, blood pressure, cardiovascular, metabolic health, whatever's good for our heart health is also good for our brain health. And it's not just about heart, it's the vascular part of that. Because if we think about our brains, which are like our retinas and our kidneys and our fingers and our toes, they are infiltrated with this intricate, very network of capillaries. And we want our finest blood vessels and capillaries to be as healthy as possible. Because if they're blocked or unhealthy, the neurons aren't receiving blood flow and oxygen and nutrition and, removal of the metabolites, etc. Immediately we're going to start to see tiny little pockets of neural degeneration, and that's a massive risk factor for going on to develop various types of dementia. So these are kind of what we understand about managing and modifying these lifestyle factors to reduce our risk of developing dementia in later life. We've still got that kind of 55-60% of cases which are due to non-modifiable risk factors. And the way I like to think about it is thinking about those old-fashioned sort of weighing scales. And we want, the odds to be in our favour. And on those scales, we would put weights of different kinds of size. And if something was increasing our risk, it would go kind of on the risk side. So it might be your genetic background. It might be your lack of education as a child. It might be your type 2 diabetes. And that's like, increasing your risk. It might be high blood pressure. But on the other side, we're kind of putting the factors that are going to balance that out. It could be, getting your hearing loss treated, having a rich social life. Perhaps you didn't have a lot of education in younger life, but you were staying socially connected and engaged in midlife, and you're doing lots of exercise and you're taking care of your cardiovascular health and trying to reduce your body weight, etc. We're kind of trying to balance the scales and tip things in our favour as much as possible. So that's how I kind of think about these risk factors that are well established and are out there in the world. I suppose, depending on, like we talked about earlier, who you are and how accessible and well educated and easy it is for you to make these lifestyle changes as a factor in there that's not really talked about. Like the longevity bros who are, super wealthy and pretty healthy and doing their little ice baths and their saunas and whatnot. They're not the ones that are perhaps struggling with poverty. Maybe they're working night shifts. Maybe they don't have access to healthcare. We've got these vastly different types of people. So we've got this massive individual variation as well across people, and how easy it is for them to make these changes.
It's true. And I like the visual representation there with the scales for people to think about it. There's the non-modifiable factors that are what they are, but looking at what of those modifiable risk factors that you can pay some attention to if it's available to you, say. I was just going to mention there that recently I had a conversation with a metabolic health researcher, and we were looking at prevention of cardiovascular disease. And in preparing for this episode as well, it became apparent how cardiovascular health, as you said, is so connected. It's like a bi-directional relationship with brain health.
100%.
And I didn't quite on the surface, before I had that episode and prepared for this, I'm like, yeah, okay, sure, they're related. But it wasn't until I asked her, I said, even something as simple as high blood pressure, what is it about that is risky for cardiovascular disease? And as she explained, that high blood pressure over time, high blood glucose over time can stiffen the arteries, and then the blood is not flowing around the body as well as it should. And as you said, all those little capillaries taking the blood around the body to the brain, we want them to be working as best they can.
100%. Yeah, I think we think about heart when we think cardiovascular, not the vascular.
Yeah.
And if we think about, say, we're getting better at treating things like diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2. And some of the negative outcomes of that used to be people would have their fingers and toes amputated because of the lack of blood flow, because their fine blood vessels were so badly damaged. They would lose their sight because the retina's also got those fine blood vessels, and say their kidney filtration, they would have kidney problems because, again, that relies on those fine blood vessels. The brain also has, those fine capillaries and blood vessels, so we need to be taking care of them. And in particular, when it comes to our brain, if we've got that blood vessel damage, the knock-on consequences in terms of damage to the neurons and the glia, those brain cells, is they don't react and regenerate like this way our skin cells do, or other cells in our body do. then they're not continually dividing and replacing themselves in your brain. So you really want to be taking care of them, prioritizing them. Luckily, we're getting better at treating, and this is what's really interesting about dementia statistics, is that we are getting better at treating the cardiovascular diseases and the metabolic diseases, the diabetes, etc. And as we are reducing those, we are reducing the risk factors for dementia. And we often hear about, cases of dementia are increasing. But when people are talking about these kinds of dementia statistics, and again, this is like, it's really important for people to people just switch off as soon as you start talking about data. But I think when we're talking about dementia statistics, and particularly when we're talking about women versus men and these biological sex differences, epidemiologists talk about this thing called the bathtub model. If you think about a bathtub, there's the water in the bathtub, there's the plug hole, and there's the taps coming in. And I often think about, like, we've got a pink tap of women coming in and a blue tap of men coming in instead of the hot and the cold. And then we've got water in the bathtub. Now, the plug hole's plugged in. Even if you've got drips of water coming in, the level in the bath is going to rise. You can either have the taps on full bore or you just have them dripping. And then how much water in the bathtub is also depending on whether the plug's, ajar or open or closed or whatever. So the water in the bathtub is prevalence. I kind of think about the pool of prevalence as everyone living with Alzheimer's disease. So everyone's swimming around in the tub who's already been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The plug hole is people leaving the prevalence pool because they die off. And sometimes men die off younger than women. And so there's more men flowing out of the plug hole. So there's more women swimming around with Alzheimer's disease in that kind of prevalence pool. So we've got women living longer, but we've also got different rates of this kind of inflow. So when people say 2/3 of Alzheimer's cases are women, they're talking about the water in the bathtub. What's interesting is that we're actually seeing in healthy, wealthy countries like Australia, we are seeing the incidence or the inflow from the tap actually slowing. Now, we're still seeing the rate in the bathtub increase because you can even have just a drip, 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 drip. The bathtub's still going to fill up with water, right? The incidence is decreasing because we're getting better at treating cardiovascular disease and diabetes and obesity and these other kind of risk factors, right? What is super interesting is if we look at the tap, the picture is very mixed because we can look at what's the difference coming in the blue tap or the pink tap, the males versus the females, what's happening in different generations coming in, people born in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, people born in different parts of the world. That's another whole story, this kind of global story. So who's swimming in the bathtub isn't just who's swimming in the bathtub, it's that inflow. In countries in the world where we've got lower, the low and middle income countries where perhaps girls historically have fewer opportunities for education, there's more women flowing into the bathtub in those parts of the world because they've had less enriched life experiences. In Australia, there's only more women flowing in the tap. Once you kind of hit your mid 80s and into your 90s, up until that point, there's still men and women flowing in at similar rates. So you've got to kind of go, if someone's 80 years old now, what decade were they born in? What was happening in their early life? So it's a much more complicated story than simply looking at this 2 out of 3 cases are women. The statistics about women and Alzheimer's and dementia isn't just about biological sex, and then people like to then kind of immediately reverse back to midlife and talk about hormones and menopause. It's about longevity, it's about life opportunities, and it's the environments people are growing up in.
That is such a great explanation because you have to look at a range of statistics, like you said, because, even myself, I'm like, oh, wow, it's quite prevalent, 2/3 for women. But as you said, that's at a particular point in time. So looking at opportunities over the lifetime, looking at do women live longer and other factors,
You can Google the epidemiologist bathtub and you'll see some nice visuals showing like the prevalence and the incidence and the mortality. And then you can, and as soon as you've got that in your head, then you can start to kind of go, what might be causing the different rates of inflow? What's causing the different rates of outflow? And that immediately opens up ways of thinking about all of the risk factors instead of just focusing on the bathtub water and thinking there must be something about being a female versus being a male. It's not that straightforward. And as soon as you start doing that, you can interrogate the risk factors and the causes and make more meaning of them.
That is great. So on that point then, you're saying there's a lot more to the picture. I think menopause is having a moment now, which women's health research, it's been underfunded and under-researched for a long period of time. So that is great. I know there's a lot of further ongoing research about looking at why there is a higher prevalence of dementia for women. But as you said, there's a lot of factors to consider and a lot of different ways of looking at the data. Because there's a lot of speculation, it must be due to the hormones and the declining hormones at menopause. What do we know today about menopause, how it changes the brain, susceptibility to dementia? What do we actually know based on the evidence?
Well, we can't separate out getting older from menopause. It's like trying to look at, someone who's 5 and someone who's 25 and separate out aging from puberty. We can't separate out, look at someone who's age 40 and someone who's age 80 who's a female and go, what's the difference? What's brain aging and what's due to menopause? Because the two go hand in hand. So what we need to do is do really good, careful, thoughtful science where we're looking at what we call these longitudinal studies where we've got a large group of women and also men and we're kind of following them through. So we start looking at them at age 35 and we follow them through every year and do every kind of analysis through till age sort of 85, and then we can tease out what are these individual trajectories. It's like taking in a movie. What's everyone's individual character development? What are the different scenes and causes and effects that kind of lead us to any point? Because right now it's very hard to tease apart menopause from getting older. Even if we look at, say, 40 to 65, we're looking at women, the average age of menopause is 51. We've got maybe like kind of 3% of women might hit menopause before the age of 40. We might have 8% of women hit menopause before the age of 45. The average is 51. So it's hard to know what is due to what. That's why we need longitudinal studies coming out. We need to kind of be patient and wait for those good studies to emerge, I suppose is what I'm trying to say. And like I say, it's very easy to just default back and to assume it's all hormones. If we look at, dementia statistics and the data that we've got, and we're looking at those modifiable risk factors like those scales, being female increases your risk, but we don't know what it is about being female. Is it about the gendered experiences you have? Or is it about your hormones? And hormones, we've got our menstrual cycles, we've got the number of pregnancies we've had, whether we were on the oral contraceptive pill or not, whether we've taken HRT or not. The current glossy social media trend is to go, HRT will prevent dementia. We do not have data to support that. We don't have data to know what is the size of that little weight that you're putting on the scales and which side are you putting it on. Because some studies are saying, it looks like it increases risk slightly. Other studies are saying, it looks like it decreases risk slightly. Other studies are saying the weight is tiny. Others are saying, it's slightly heavier. Right now, we don't know where to put the weight on the scale. And I think the data is tending towards perhaps even being net neutral. The driver isn't hormones and the fix isn't HRT. Time will tell whether that story becomes a little bit clearer. So that's why we need to be when we're thinking about prevalence versus incidence, because if it was simply hormones, we wouldn't see these rates of incidence or rates of change differ in different parts of the world and different generations. It would always be the same. It would always be stable, and it's not. And so what we need to do is just sort of start thinking about, what do we know about midlife brains? What do we know about how our brains change during menopause? And what can we do to kind of put ourselves in the best position to age in a healthy way? That said, there's plenty of things that we can do, and we've talked about what those midlife factors are. There's all of this research emerging all of the time, and a lot of its cohort studies, these kind of snapshots in time looking at before, during, and after menopause. This is what's happening in the brain. And there's probably about 5 or 6 things that we know are happening in the brain, how they're related to each other, what's the kind of the cause and effect, the chicken and egg, the domino, and how that relates to late life brain health is still a little bit unclear. So if I was to think about the 5 or 6 things that we know about, we know 1, roller coastering levels of estrogen, and then the flatlining of estrogen changes how neurons in our hypothalamus regulate our body temperature. And that's where the classic vasomotor symptoms, the hot flashes, the night sweats come from, because our reproductive fitness and our ability to carry a pregnancy and be fertile is very closely tied up to body temperature. We need very tight body temperature control to be reproductively fit. And there's no evolutionary drive at the end of your reproductive years, when you go through reproductive senescence, you don't need to worry about body temperature anymore, and hormones regulate that. So without hormones, your body temperature is dysregulated. There's no evolutionary drive to be hot or cold or not. So we're kind of stuck with it. And we know that that causes the vasomotor symptoms, and that's quite a clear neurological, biological pathway there. Sort of related to that is how our brain and our body are trying to cool us down. Involves activation of our sympathetic nervous system. So, vasodilation, sweating, and if we're asleep, jolting us awake to behave in a way to cool down, or maybe then to warm up again if we've got cold. And repeated sympathetic nervous system activation kind of leads us to this sort of wired hypervigilant state whereby it feels like anxiety in our body, and then our brain starts filling in the gap of what to worry about. Because if you're age 50 and you're feeling slightly hypervigilant, you'll find something to worry about because your brain constantly wants to fill in the gap to explain why it's feeling something in your body. So that's kind of related. We've got change in how efficiently all cells in our body, including neurons, metabolize and create energy. And we do know that estrogen is responsible for some of the glucose metabolism of our neurons in our brain. It's nothing to do with insulin in our brain. And in some women, their brains become like kind of a little less metabolically efficient. And that perhaps feels like brain fog or fatigue or fuzziness, but it also might be related to the disrupted sleep. We know that we've got changing patterns of how networks interact and connect and communicate in the brain to do the jobs that brains do, to think and to solve problems. Brains go from having the networks very kind of segregated and efficient to integrated and connected and kind of recruiting more neurons in to get the job done. The brain is adapting. Is that underpinned by that metabolic change or underpinned by changes in neurotransmitters? We don't really know. And then we've also got, and it's very hard to know whether it's hormonal aging or just natural aging, is changes in like kind of grey matter volume and white matter organization. It appears that the brain kind of goes through a bit of a neurological transition and then kind of settles into its new state post-menopause. So we've got all these different things that we know are changing. It's hard to know how much is hormonal, how much is natural aging, because we can't tease out 40 to 65. We can't tease the two out. We can only look at people who go through menopause like maybe much earlier or much later than average. And then we've got these small signals that are emerging from this kind of cloud of individual variability that we're trying to tell stories about right now. And the story isn't very tellable yet.
Really appreciate your style, the way you explain it in relatable terms without the fear-mongering, because with regard to menopause and the brain, recently on social media, there was a narrative going around, fear-mongering, got a lot of attention, and it was that during menopause, the brain eats itself. I think I did see you comment on someone else. What do you want to say about that?
I woke up one morning in early December or late November or whenever it was to like all of these messages on my Instagram, social media overnight when I was asleep. And I don't love jumping on and doing myth busting, but that story was utterly ridiculous, and neither of those people is actually a neuroscientist. And that particular clip was actually cut from a podcast because I went back and listened to the original podcast, and there was a couple of grabs from that podcast cut and mixed together, created to drive the social media algorithm. It was like very melodramatic. The brain eats itself during menopause without HRT. And the kind of the basis of that is some studies that have been done in rodents. I can't remember whether it was rats or mice, looking at their reproductive senescence. And most mammals, when they are no longer fertile, they kind of die within a very short space of time, weeks, months, or years. We don't. We live on for a whole lot longer, and that rate of change is much sped up. And the idea is that when the neurons become less able to metabolize glucose, as I kind of talked about, they start casting around for other sources of energy. And these can include, amongst many other sources, ketone bodies, which are made by our liver and, when we're kind of exercising and metabolizing fats. But one source is locally within the brain, the glia, or the fatty kind of myelin sheaths that wrap around neurons. In these mice, at the extreme old age, they started to metabolize the fatty myelin sheaths as a source of energy for the neurons. And so the white matter kind of became disaggregated. And so I suppose you could call that catabolism, but it was not looking at hormone replacement therapy. It wasn't looking at humans, and the story was turned into, without HRT, the brain will literally eat itself, which is such an overly dramatic way to talk about what is going on in rats and mice. We don't know what's happening in human women. And this constant pushing of hormone replacement therapy as the answer, when all you've got to hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And I will say, I am 51 and I am taking hormone replacement therapy because when I stopped taking the pill at age 49, which I had taken on and off for many, many, many years, just fine, thank you very much. The pill is also getting a bad rap. I developed vasomotor symptoms within about 7 days. Went on hormone replacement therapy. It managed my hot flashes and my vasomotor symptoms at night, so I was sleeping fine, and so that kind of hypervigilance went away. And that was all within kind of the course of a month. My little menopause story happened. If I thought that hormone replacement therapy was going to prevent dementia and stop my brain eating itself, as a neuroscientist working on women's brain health, as someone who takes hormone replacement therapy, I would be saying this. But the evidence does not back up that story. It might change in time, but right now that is not the story. But it's not, dramatic enough to say that to drive a social media algorithm. We just need to be really, really careful. We're so busy here in Australia talking about social media and teenagers and Snapchat and what it's doing to them, and forgetting to be discerning ourselves about, who's driving the algorithms that is feeding us these stories at midlife. So, I did a bit of work in that space trying to counter that story, as have many others. But being a careful, thoughtful, nuanced neuroscientist it is much harder to unravel fear than to create it in the first place for your own commercial benefit.
Very true. Apart from getting the clicks, what other benefit do they get? Do you think it's just to drive towards their pages, their services? Because they're not going to make money off prescribing the hormones, are they?
Well, I don't think it's that. It's about the business ecosystem that they're working within. And I think it's easy to be dramatic than to be thoughtful and careful. And I suppose that's not kind of how I ethically want to do things and run a business. I suppose, that kind of comes down to you can choose to be loose with the truth if that's what you want to do. That's not what I choose to do. And I think when it comes to the brain is making meaning of a lot of sources of information, both within the space it's in, within our body. And I talk about, there's our bottom-up biological body and the signals that our brain is receiving to kind of manage, our body. And then our body and our brain are in this complex ecosystem of the world we're in, and there's a lot of information coming in through our senses about the rising and the setting of the sun and other people. And then, the information that's streaming on in our mobile phone, we've got a potential world war being held in the palm of our hand now, and we're kind of live streaming that into our brain. And our brain doesn't know it's not in the palm of our hand. Whereas once upon a time, you'd watch the TV news and you'd turn it off, and at the end of the day, and it would be on the other side of the world. And then we've got this meaning that we're constantly making of this kind of information from our bodies and the outside world. And then you've got to add in the space-time continuum, like what happened in our childhood still matters now. And it's so complicated and there's so many factors that it's easier to try and oversimplify. And the more complicated something is, the more tendency we have to want to tell a simple story about that, particularly if that's not your discipline or you haven't got that experience or you've not made the decision to be careful and thoughtful about it. That's why I think they're doing it.
Yeah, thank you. And given that, like you said, our attention is so hijacked these days, people are just trying to put something out there to grab our attention, I guess, rather than to the facts.
And some people lie.
Yeah.
They just outright lie.
Yeah. But it's hard for people like me, people listening to this podcast who may not be trained to decipher that.
Yeah.
It's really hard, and it's really unfortunate because that got a lot of attention. But on that point, if you wanted to take an opportunity to talk about the books that you've written, and I know you have some online courses to help people with evidence-based information. So if you'd like to speak about that, as well as where do you suggest, or where can people go to find quality information, either online or particular organisations about brain health?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time right now because when we look at, say, things like clinical practice guidelines, which is what, like, say, your GP might, be informing your GP on how to treat you when you sort of rock up in her office or whatever. When we're looking at how those are developed and then that information disseminated both within the healthcare system and within the kind of public health. It's about kind of consensus across, lots of different people and lots of different studies, and panels have kind of sat down and sort of thoughtfully worked through systematic reviews and meta-analyses of the data. We haven't cherry-picked this study and that study. And often, therefore, there's no speaking in absolutes, and social media is all about absolutes and black and white and drama. And when people are speaking in absolutes, or they're saying, well, the institutions are hiding the knowledge from you and I have the answer, they should be quite clear and obvious red flags. But I also understand that people are in a situation right now where they feel like they're not as trusting of institutions or governments or universities, and people want that kind of resonance that they get from that kind of parasocial relationship that they develop with a person on social media. So I suppose it's hard to be discerning, and I don't want to tell people to go and look at clinical practice guidelines. But say if it comes to something like menopause and you're here in Australia, you can go and take a look at the Menopause Society, the Australasian Menopause Society. You can look at Jean Hales for Women's Health, but then you'll be hearing voices as well telling you that they're old school or they're stuck in their ways. Well, if old school is being careful and thoughtful and methodical and looking at the consensus across, different types of studies and not just who's frothing at the edges, then that's the path that I would encourage people to go down. There's also an interesting tool that I've started pointing people towards, particularly in my courses. And my courses are typically professional development courses, say for psychologists or teachers or whatnot, to kind of come in and do their CPD hours. And I'm teaching them a lot of this. But there's a new AI tool, and I know lots of people are anti-AI, but other people are using AI all the time. Whatever. It's not a moral decision. This is just a tool that you can use called Consensus AI. I think now it's kind of embedded within ChatGPT, or you can just look up at Consensus AI. And what that does is kind of like a really rough and ready kind of systematic review of the literature. You can put in a question. You can put in does creatine help improve cognition in women? Or does red wine cause dementia? Or should I use HRT to prevent dementia? You can ask it a question, and then it goes and does a systematic review of the literature and then gives you this kind of really cool, kind of coloured traffic light system. And it's called Consensus. So it gives kind of red, orange, yellow, and green, looks across the literature saying, oh, yeah, well, does red wine cause dementia? Some studies say, yes, it does. Some say, oh, maybe we're not sure. Others say probably not. And others say, absolutely. And it gives this kind of nice visual traffic light system so you can see the balance of the literature and the consensus. And then it goes through every one of those studies that it's gathered, and it prioritizes a meta-analysis, and it will prioritize a systematic review. And if it can't look at them, it will prioritize the types of studies that we know are more valid versus the statistics are wobblier. And then it talks about why it chose that study to embed in that little mini sort of rough and ready systematic review designed just for you. So that's a really great tool for people to get a plain language summary and answers to questions that they might have. And then you'll automatically see when someone's talking about one particular study or another, and we hear people going, oh, don't cherry pick. What they might done is you might get, 18 out of 20 studies are saying HRT does not cause dementia, but 2 say they do. And then people are only talking about those 2 studies. That's literally the cherry picking instead of looking at the consensus. That will, in the same way as giving people answers, teaches people about the process of science and the process of consensus and the process of decision making, rather than this study said this, this study said that, and getting confused about what to do. I think that's quite a useful tool which has emerged in the last couple of years. Consensus AI. And the word consensus is really the key.
Yeah, I'm going to look at that, and I'll include that in the show notes as well. I think that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
What are the books that you've written?
Oh, so I've written, I say 3.5. The Women's Brain book, The Neuroscience of Health, Hormones and Happiness. So that was looking across the lifespan of how our brain is shaped and sculpted by the experiences we have as girls and women, both experiences we have out in the world and our, biological and reproductive experiences. And that was first published in 2017. And then I updated it because there's so much new research. And so there was a second edition in 2025. In 2023, I published Baby Brain, The Surprising Neuroscience of How Pregnancy and Motherhood Sculpt Our Brains and Change Our Minds for the Better. So that's looking at the neurobiology of matrescence. and that came out in 2023. And then the last book I wrote also came out in 2025. I was very busy in 2024, was Brain Health for Dummies. And that's the For Dummies brand, Excel spreadsheets for dummies or whatever.
Yeah.
Brain Health for Dummies. And I wrote that, and that also came out in 2025. I get a bit tired now if I have to write a text message. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, are you planning to write another soon?
Look, I'm really worn out, but I think if I do write another book, I don't want to write about menopause. I'd be more interested in writing about midlife in general, for everyone. The current social media narrative has been around menopause, hormone therapy, dementia risk, and it presents it as this very neat equation. The science is going, that's not the equation.
No. And still probably a way off before we have more answers on that.
Yeah, but I mean, if there's some really, as I said, and science is kind of going through a bit of a renaissance at the moment, whereby we've got like consortiums and collaborations and data sharing and open access biobanks of data. So we've got, you could have 20 research labs around the world looking at menopause in the brain, say, and then they're all putting all of that data together into one kind of open source kind of database, and then other labs can all go in and mine that data. And, you might have like 50,000 brain scans in there from different people, but that's not like spreadsheet kind of stats anymore. That's like machine learning, AI kind of analysis of that data. That's why I said we're starting to see these signals emerge from the noise that we didn't have before. And we've got, instead of a randomized controlled trial of menopause hormone therapy now, and then waiting to see what happens when you're in your 80s, well, can't speed up time. You have to wait 30, 40, 50 years, right? There's like different, very clever statistical ways of doing kind of randomized sort of studies of people based on like their kind of genetic profiles. And so there are kind of new sophisticated tools and statistics emerging that are giving us some interesting clues. And once again, the story very much from even the most recent stuff coming out is menopause is important, but so is brain aging, and hormones are probably not the loudest voice in the crowd or the heaviest weight on the scales.
One thing you mentioned, and you were having a bit of a laugh, but it's something that I flagged to ask you if I got time. Another narrative going around on social media lately was that high doses of creatine may hold promise for cognitive benefits with our memory and such. They're saying doses above the standard muscle dose, like up to 10, 20 grams per day. Is that research only in mice so far, or what do you know of that research? Or is there any substance to it?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of substance to it. What's the reality? Creatine's very well studied within like kind of strength training, and it's got quite a good safety profile, meaning that there's not that many risks. It's pretty safe. It's not like, some other, like a medication that you could overdose on very easily. Some people with kidney problems need to be careful. The data on women and brain health and midlife cognition, there's a few studies. They're very, very small. And there was a few kind of statistically significant improvements in women who were taking creatine and doing tests of working memory and other kinds of cognitive tests versus women who were not. I think there's some studies looking at sleep deprivation. Is it at the point where we're going, we should add it to the water like we've added fluoride to the water? It's like a public health intervention. Absolutely not. Is it going to harm you to try it? Absolutely not. Are there a lot of commercial interests at heart in terms of pushing creatine right now? Absolutely. That's kind of where we're at.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. So before we close, I'd love to ask, what are some of your particular rituals, your practices or habits that help you to mind your being?
100% sleep is at the core of everything. I've always been a very good deep sleeper. I don't have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep. And when I do, that's to me quite a canary in the gold mine. There's a lot of stress going on. Like, I haven't slept very well the last few nights. I've got a bit of a sore throat. I'm a bit croaky. So, sleep is just the foundation of everything, and then all of the basics. But then, like, maybe I just do all of the sleep hygiene things because I've always done them, hot shower, cold bed, that kind of thing, morning sunlight, etc. And I just love having my husband always brings me a coffee in bed in the morning, and it's just like such a happy little moment of the day for me. Beautiful. Like social connections and having like enriched kind of social experiences are so important to me, like my book club. I'm in a musical theatre group. I do watercolor classes, and I do them like because they're like just really socially interactive and fun and engaging, and we're kind of working on things together with groups of people. Because a lot of my work is, I work for myself, so it's a wee bit solitary. So I try to actively do as many social things as I can with my time, because I know that that's just a really fundamental part of brain health. And then all of the other boring things, like strength training and going for walks with my dog and swimming in the ocean. And then I just try to give myself some grace for when the shit hits the fan. We can't all be perfect all of the time. And sometimes you get a sore knee, or, you've got a teenager going through something, or a parent going through something, or, someone talks about the brain eating itself without HRT during menopause. And so you've got to drop everything and counter that. So I'm just trying to also give myself a bit of grace as well, and try and have a bit of fun along the way.
Fun is very important. I love how you say giving yourself grace. Have you always been able to do that? Because I find a lot of midlife women is the time when we start to do it more so. It's so important.
I think motherhood teaches you that in so many ways, and especially like my oldest son, he finishes HSC last year and he's gone off to university, and like the beginning of motherhood, like the onset of matrescence and becoming his mother, it's like a full circle moment. And then him going away to university is another full circle moment. And it's just a real time to kind of pause and reflect, and to grieve and to celebrate, and to hold like lots of conflicting emotions, and to think about aging, and to think about your mother aging, and to think about them growing up. And I think giving myself, like, I was so hard on myself when I became a mother. I don't want to do that again. And, I've had a sore knee for a couple of months, and then I got tennis elbow from whacking the tennis ball to the dog. And it was waking me up at night because it hurt so much.
So painful.
And I was like, I'm doing all of the things, and my elbow hurts. And then some other stressful stuff kind of happened, and so I wasn't sleeping, and it's like I didn't really, like, you can try so hard to do all the things right, and then like just crap happens, and you just have to be a bit kinder and gentler on yourself in the way that you would be to a little child or your kids or other people around you. So I think it's just the stage of life you're at. I just want to kind of as I said, have a bit more joy along the way, have a good joy span as well as health span as well as lifespan.
Love it. Yeah, it's so important. I'm in the same boat with my daughter, finished HSC last year, and she's my youngest. And it is that conflicting emotions, but it is a time for a reset. Like, I now can do this, I have a bit more time, but it's also like, oh, my baby's growing up. She turns 18 next month, and it's like...
Yeah, it's like, I think that's what the word, I always cry when I think about it. I think that's what like the word bittersweet was invented for. Like,
that's the definition.
You're so happy and proud and excited for them. Like, we dropped my oldest son down off, and we just went down for the day and moved him into halls, and it was like, we're so excited for him. And so sad that phase of life is over, but remembering how good that was. And it's just like, and you just have to like honour these kind of life cycle moments, I suppose, when they get married and then when they have kids and all of that. And it's just, but we've still got one who's still at high school. And so, we can kind of think about his next 2 years of high school. And we lost one of our, you met my other dog. He's a couple of years old now. We lost the dog that we'd had since the boys were little a couple of years ago, Jasper. And when he died, we were just, of course, we were so sad. And then we were like, looking at the photos, they were the good old days when the boys were little and we had Jasper. And then we're going, well, the boys are still here. Like, one day we'll look back on this now and go, well, those were the good old days. And we were like, what will be the good old days of right now? And then we decided straight away, we were like, let's get a new puppy, because someone told me we can be sad and happy at the same time. You could be sad about losing your old dog and happy about a puppy. And it's okay to have both experiences and emotions at once. That was like this weird life lesson that, like, let's just open up to the next thing that comes our way and try and like make right now the good old days. And so when we both turned 50 last year, and initially I was like, I don't know whether I want to party, and we did loads of really great things all year. And then in the end we were like, well, every day's the good old days, so let's have a party. And that was our theme.
Beautiful.
Let's make today the good old days. And I feel like that's just such a philosophy to live by. And, I've got people I went through school with who, we've lost in the last few years to cancer and accidents and things, and you never know. So try and be a bit more joyful.
Yeah.
And not try and hold on
because that creates suffering anyway. Like you said, we talk about the past as the good old days, but we only have the present moment now, and they're just different days, and there's still good things to come. We just don't know what they are yet. Where can people find more about your work or find your courses, find you online?
Yep. So drsarahmckay.com. MCKAY is just the portal to it all. There'll be links to the courses, my professional development training programs, and my social media and my books and etc. That's where it all happens.
Thank you. I'll link to those in the show notes as well. So final question is, what are you most hopeful about with regard to particular research or advances in neuroscience?
Oh, look, I definitely think the consortiums and the data sharing and that collaborative approach, it means that the signals can emerge from the noise. What we need and what I'm trying to do whenever I feel like just giving up and just becoming a watercolour artist is the useful science translation, communication of that out into the world.
Thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you for being a trustworthy, evidence-based voice out in this community. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you for the invitation to chat.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Mind Your Being podcast. If you enjoyed it or found it helpful, please follow the show wherever you get your podcasts and share it with a friend who might enjoy it too. If you have a moment, please leave a quick review. It really helps others discover the podcast. Thanks again for being here. Take care, and until next time, mind your being.